Hey YouTube! Today we are talking about tarot, but in particular tarot for a certain kind of tarot reader. Now, I've jokingly titled this video Tarot for the Uptight Intellectual, but what I really mean here is I wanted to speak to people like me who think of themselves as being kind of mental focused, really into learning and study, ordered thinkers, organized, rational. Maybe you're an INTJ. Maybe you're just a particularly practical person. And for whatever reason you are interested in tarot, you've stumbled upon tarot. And you're curious about it, but you're not sure how it meshes with your sort of personality type or the way that you are. This is particularly for newer readers, but I would say it also might be of interest to folks who have encountered tarot and been reading maybe for a little bit, but don't feel that they fit in with the tarot community, or aren't really sure where there are others like them, or maybe you've been trying to learn and read, but find that something is not really meshing right, or you'd like to think of ways that you could jive more with what's natural to you. So that's why I decided to do this. We're going to talk about ways that you can learn and read tarot that are very much in alignment with this type, and also ways that you can use tarot as a tool to maybe become more balanced, or bring in other aspects for yourself. So I think the most important thing to start with, that I very, very strongly believe, is that tarot is for everyone. Tarot is for everyone. There is no tarot reader type of person or tarot client type of person. Tarot is by its nature something that brings in all of us. So it may be that if your initial exposure to tarot has been sort of in a very spiritual realm, or a very intuitive realm, or you've met readers who are very feeling centered, not very logic centered, who are more intuitive, you might either feel a real disconnect from that, or just feel like there is no way, imposter syndrome, I cannot be that person, I'm not that person. And if you're in this place, I think it's important to note that there are as many ways to read tarot as there are tarot readers. There are a lot of readers that approach it in a very sort of grounded, practical, logical way. There's nothing that says you can't engage your brain in reading tarot. I find that when I interpret the cards, yes, there are elements of intuition, and I do have some degree of belief in a kind of energy or a connection to the deck itself, but at the same time, I do think my brain is, combining different things I know, or that my brain can serve as a foundation or a structure within which my intuition can flow. So you might approach tarot, especially at first, as a set of tools that isn't necessarily connected to a particular energy or spirit or God, if that doesn't feel right for you. Tarot can be kind of like therapy, in the sense that it provides these archetypes that can help you work through problems, work through questions, can be very practical in that way. I mean, if you're a nerdy, intellectual type person, there's so many resources out there. You can learn more about the symbology of tarot. Maybe you really get into some of the more symbology heavy decks, learning about astrological correspondences, learning about the history of the tarot. Benabel Wynn is an excellent resource if you're in that camp. Jung, you could learn about Jungian archetypes. I would think of that as a very sort of intellectual tradition in some ways. So don't feel like you are not the right person to be a tarot reader. And also, I think another thing to keep in mind is that there are cards for the intellect, for, that relate to logical things. The tarot contains within it everything, all of the universe, all of humanity, all of experience. You just have to learn how to find it in there. And so, I know I was very, when I read the first resource I read on tarot, which was Michelle T's Modern Tarot, and I read just the initial brief description of the sword suit. I was like, oh, there's a suit for me. And granted, like, the sword suit can be a little tough, and it's more about like brain chemistry than necessarily intellect, but it can be about intellect and communication. And it was very comforting to me when I first encountered it to be like, hey, here's the suit. And I very much like resonate personally with the Queen of Swords. I pull the King and the Page a lot. So there's something that feels really good to me about that suit. Although I think you can also absolutely, I think it's important to not just like look for the obvious cards like that, but also realize that that concepts in the tarot, like if you read that a particular card, for example, deals with creativity, I think a lot of times we can be boxed in by our definitions of what creativity means or what passion is or desire. Some of these words, they don't feel maybe always naturally connected to people who are very rational and brain first, but like you can absolutely apply the wand suit, which is all about kind of passion work and pursuing things that fire you up. What fires you up could be creating a database, like it could be anything. And so I think that's another thing, is not to limit yourself into certain cards, but to find how you align maybe in a different way than other people do with different cards. I also, like, you might, if you've been in tarot communities and listening to people talk about tarot, you might find that very different cards resonate with you the strongest than other people. Like, for example, in the majors, the card I probably most resonate with is the Emperor, which is a card that for a lot of queer tarot readers is kind of traumatic and like not comfortable because of the associations with patriarchal authority. But for me, the Emperor is very much like order, structure, control, strong foundations. Like I love the number 4. I love the kind of satisfying nature of a square. Like I very much feel like the Empress, so the Emperor card feels good to me. Or like Justice is another major card that I resonate with a lot because it's about kind of a practical, it's a very practical card. It's a realistic card. It's about seeing the world as it is. It's about kind of having your own vision of justice and looking at the world to see if it aligns, and that kind of thing works really well for me. So know that there are cards that are gonna click a lot with you, and they might not always be the same that click with other people. As far as recommendations for how you might approach learning the tarot, I think there are tons of ways, and there are so many resources out there, so I'll just share my own experience. The first deck I bought, so I really was like, okay, I was drawn to the tarot because, and I think a lot of us are, it is a system. It's a structure. It's a very, like, yes, there's a lot of freedom within that, and I think the tarot is a perfect example of constraint breeds creativity. Like, it gives you a framework within which to be creative and maybe feel things that for some of us, that freedom may not be natural, but when we have that constraint, it becomes more natural. So that's a great thing about the tarot. And I think it's interesting, like some people who start tarot, I notice, will freak out about having to memorize a bunch of cards, be like, oh my god, I gotta take notes, like I don't want to do this. I was really excited about that. But the first deck I bought, it was funny, the creator was like, don't read anything, just interpret. Like, this deck is great for beginners and you should have no preconceived notions and you should just let it flow. And for me, that didn't work at all. I got the deck and I was like, I'm trying, but it feels weird. Like, I just don't, am I not intuitive? What's going on? But then when I learned more, one, I realized that deck just doesn't really connect with a lot of the cards to the traditional interpretations. I mean, it certainly might in the artist's eye, but I was not able to make that connection. So it wasn't the best deck for me to start with. You may find that it's best for you to start with something that is closer to, say, the Rider-Waite-Smith imagery, because there's a kind of a strong representational element to that, and for people with brains like ours, that might connect better at first. But the other thing is, I gave myself permission, after realizing that that approach wasn't going to work for me, I gave myself permission to make a big-ass spreadsheet, and that big-ass spreadsheet is my favorite tool. I'm not always looking at it directly when I read, but big ass spreadsheet, man. Like, seriously, make one. The way I did mine is I have a row. So I have one tab for tarot card meanings. I have a row per card, so 78 rows, and then I have a column per source. So when I started out, I read, I want to say one book, and then because I didn't want to use just a single source, being like a curious person, being like, I want to learn all the things, teach me all the systems. I wanted to look at other interpretations. Looked at a couple websites. So I had a column for each source, and then once I'd gone through maybe 3 or 4 sources, and I was starting to get familiar with things, I went across each row and I read what I had written, and then I made my interpretations column, basically a compilation of what I took from each source and what I thought was interesting, and then like if I read those, what did that come together for me to mean? And over time, I've added columns, so every time I read a tarot book, I'm sitting there taking notes. It might just be a line of what's different from other interpretations, or for people who are very different, I might write a lot more. If I look at, particular blogger who's doing a whole series, I'll give them a column. And then I also have an other column where I'll write just, if one person writes about one card, I think that's interesting, I'll just put it in the other column with an attribution there. So I've gone through a lot of different sources that way, and every so often I'll just sit down and read across again and just, build on my interpretation, which also is built from my experiences of reading with the cards. And I think for people with brains like ours, one thing that might come up a lot for you is as you read a bunch of different sources, you will start to spark new things. You will make new connections. You'll be like, oh shit, that's blah, blah, blah. that makes me think of this concept, and that can be really exciting and really, really fun. And so you write those things down. So I had that tab, which is sort of the main place for meanings. I then have a tab for the readings themselves. So I do actually write out my readings on the computer. I know a lot of people will say, like, when you do a tarot reading, you need to clear your space and not have a computer there. And I think if the energy of the computer feels uncomfortable or blocking to you, then certainly follow that advice. But for me, I realized that like my magic, like for me, like programming is magic. Using a computer can be part of my magic. So I started to connect more to the idea of magic, which you don't necessarily have to connect tarot and magic, but for me, I was able to connect with that much more when I gave myself permission to include the computer, to include whatever worked well for me. So the computer for me is a great tool, and when I read, I have my computer sitting next to me. I look at the spread, I take a moment with it, but then I do type up, and the way I read is through typing. Like the way I actually form the interpretation, I'm typing it. So if that works for you, go ahead and do it. There's no rules. And having that tab in my spreadsheet means that I can go back and read through previous readings. I also have a separate tab where I do all my deck interviews, and I use a couple different interview spreads. So another thing, I think people who read tarot this way, you might be more comfortable reading with spreads, reading with definite spreads. You might get really into, as I have, looking up different spreads. Another thing I have separate from my spreadsheet is I have a PowerPoint or Google Slides, just because it's a convenient way to put squares, a lot of little rectangles in. And it's about 100 slides of spreads, where whenever I see a cool spread, I will use rectangles to, draw out the spread, and then I'll write the positions. So anyway, deck interviews, tab for that. And then I've started doing, once I've been with the deck for a year, I started doing a check-in interview, and I put it on the same row so I can see the initial interview and then what happened a year later. That spread is on my Instagram over at Avery Fawcett, spelled the same as this channel. It is my name. So you can find that there. Just scroll down and look for the kind of teal image if you're looking for that spread. And then I have a bunch of other tabs. So I have one with my deck wish list. I also find that I really enjoy, again, making connections and associations. So I have a tab for sort of how cards relate to one another, and I'll put like similar cards, opposing cards. I think I have 3 columns, so it could be 2 or 3 cards, and then I'll write notes on how they go together and like interesting connections between them. I have a tab for people and situations, so things that make me think of the cards. I even have a whole column just for Marvel characters and scenes in Marvel, because I've been doing this kind of funny Marvel tarot project, making images of MCU tarot cards. Trying to think what else is in there. I started doing a separate tab on reversals because I wanted to think through, and again, I have a column for every different way I know of to read a reversal, and then the cards in rows. So there might be like 11 different interpretations of one reverse card. I find that doing this kind of thing like really actually helps me to read. So that's how I like work with my personality. But I would say also, one of the things I found, again, like constraint breeding creativity, is that my intuition is actually served by the fact that tarot gives me the structure and system. So in some ways I'm tricking my brain into being like, this is a logical thing with patterns. You're happy with that, right? You like that. But then it helps me to dig deeper. It helps me to understand myself. It helps me with self-awareness and really like unlocks emotion, different ways of thinking about a thing. So you may find that you come to identify as more intuitive or as more emotion-centered or watery or whatever through reading the tarot. I am astrologically a double Cancer and a Pisces. And that never made any sense to me until recently, that I realized like I am really watery. If somebody was having coffee with somebody from a tarot group, and she said this obvious thing, but it like totally blew my mind, that water needs a container, right? Like in order for water to be its full potential, water needs earth. And so part of why I'm so grounded and like want to make associations and want to like have structure and rigidity and logic is that it creates a space for the water. If you don't have structure, the water just flows everywhere. So and becomes less powerful. So I thought that was really cool. Like that is very much how I've experienced tarot. And you may find that if you start with your big ass spreadsheet, it gives your brain the safety to be like, great, I've got all this memorized. I know these cards. I know them by heart. And then when I read, it's like, it frees up my emotional self to react. So I think that's been a really interesting thing to learn. And I think it's super helpful to learn. So those are my sort of initial thoughts on this. If anybody is interested in exploring related topics and starting a discussion, please comment below. I'd love to hear from other people who come from a similar place and hear about how you've approached reading tarot, or how you've approached tarot as a client or just an enthusiast. And if you enjoy content like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. All right, thanks so much. Have a great day.